Alright, so in this video I'm going to talk about lighting and scene visuals in SceneForge. Now before we get started, it's important to note that SceneForge is not meant to be a 100% one-to-one recreation of real-world lighting. As with any real-time lighting / rendering technology, it is still an approximation. And while we are actively improving the lighting system day by day, the goal is to make it a really easy way to just plan the way your shoot looks, as well as create realistic virtual backgrounds for virtual production, not be a one-to-one lighting simulation. So with that being said, let's jump right in. So the easiest way to adjust the way your scene looks is by going to the Visuals tab and just changing the time of day. That can be done with this slider here, and that's pretty much it. It's very basic, it's very simple. You can change the time of day. But on top of that, we have a bunch of other options, such as for pro users, you can change the weather preset. We have a bunch of different weather presets that change just the way your scene looks. Right now it's on clear sky, but I'm going to make it cloudy number 3. And you can see now we have these beautiful big fluffy clouds in our sky. And we can also change to other presets such as foggy, rain, and all of these affect both the lighting as well as the weather particle systems that you can see here. I'm going to make this on cloudy 1 so we can continue working on it. Next we have ground settings. That allows you to change the ground material as well as its tiling. Then you have sky settings. So here you can turn on and off the sun shafts, which is kind of like the sun rays that you see, and turn on and off volumetric clouds. Now, volumetric clouds is one of the most taxing and performance-heavy things that SceneForge does because they can get pretty, realistic. But that is why we have a couple different options for cloud quality. So right now I'm on the highest, which I call full simulation. But these can be altered to go all the way down to very low. Now, obviously, very low is very low, but because it has like a very soft, fluffy look, it might be a aesthetic that you're going for intentionally. So it's worth messing around with that even if you don't think that's what you're looking for. You can adjust the move speed as well as the global coverage, which depending on your cloud preset has different effects. I'll leave it like that. Next, we have post-processing effects. So post-processing is essentially a layer on top of what your camera sees that adds extra processing onto the image. So we have a couple options here. The first option is Raindrop camera effects. Now this one also is very performance heavy, so keep that in mind, but it is pretty cool. If you turn this on, it will simulate raindrops on the camera lens. So if I go into shoot mode and control this camera a bit, you can see that it looks like the lens is very wet. But of course this doesn't make much sense if it's not raining out. So if we switch this to a heavy rain, now the scene looks a lot more moody and realistic with the raindrops on the lens. I'm going to turn this off for now. Next we have bloom. Now bloom is essentially an effect that simulates or changes the look of how glowy things are in your scene, for lack of a better word. From a technical level, it simulates the light scattering of actual camera lenses when the light interacts with little imperfections that basically all lenses have. But in practice, it changes how emissive material, such as the surface of this light, actually looks. So I'm going to increase the intensity of this light. I'm going to make it nighttime. And you can see if I turn down the bloom, the light is having an impact on the scene, as you can see here. I'm going to adjust that. But the actual material isn't really showing that glow that you would expect from filming an actual light. And that's where bloom comes in. If you increase it, that adds that glow on top of the emissive material that you expect from a real camera. Going overboard with it might not be the best idea, but you can, and the option is there. So when paired with a real camera, it really adds to the realistic effect of the scene. Especially when changing the color effect, it makes things look really good. I'll turn this down. Next we have ambient occlusion, or AO as it says here. Now ambient occlusion is essentially contact shadows between two surfaces. And the best way to explain this is that if I shine a flashlight right onto my hand, there will still be contact shadows between my fingers. That's just the way light works when it interacts with two intersecting surfaces. So if I make this daytime, our scene right here, specifically right in this intersection between the floor and the cube here, is very flat, it's very bland. So what we can do is turn on ambient occlusion, and you'll see it'll add contact shadows between those two surfaces. Now it's very subtle, but it adds so much to the realism of a rendered image. You can change the intensity of the effect as well as the radius that the effect gets applied on. So obviously, for most cases, you don't want to go overboard with this, but it's worth messing around with to get the look that you're looking for. Ambient occlusion is also a very performance-heavy effect, so it's important that you look through the AO presets for fastest to highest quality to find one that either looks the best or performs the best on your machine. So that is an overview of scene lighting and post-processing, but now we're going to talk about how we actually create lighting in our scene. So you got a glimpse of it previously when working with these lights, but I'm going to turn the scene lighting down and show you this spotlight. So when working with lights, you can bring them in through the Create menu by going Create, Lights, and you have a bunch of different options here. They basically all work the same way, except some project the light in different ways. So for example, a light bulb will project the light in all directions versus a panel light or a spotlight, which will shine the light in just the direction that it's facing on. So for this example, we're going to use the spotlight that we already have in here. Now this is a spotlight that has a stand. You can also add one without a stand, that's just the light. And similar to the crane camera and the tripod camera, the stands themselves are really just for simulating your film set and less about simulating the light. They both have the same effect on your scene, it's really just a personal preference. Working with the stand does have the addition of being able to adjust the rotation of the physical light, which you may or may not want. Alright, so we have a couple options with working with these types of lights. I'm going to rotate this so we have a better setup here, so I can better demonstrate what the lights can do. Alright. So here we have a light. Now this is a spotlight. We have a couple options here. From top to bottom, we have volumetric VFX. That basically simulates the light beam that you see here, which may or may not be desired. Next, you have global illumination and indirect lighting modes. I'm going to talk about what that does in a second. We have the power type, which is how we can change the intensity. So we can either do lumens or watts. Lumens is kind of like a standard brightness, essentially. It all depends on the scale of your scene to have a realistic impact. So that's something worth messing with and understanding. Because, for example, if I turn this all the way up to 3000, it's not going to have the same effect on a small object versus a big object, obviously. So it's important that you keep things as realistically sized as possible. I'm going to rotate this like here. So lumens you can adjust that way, or you can switch to watts, and that's how you can adjust the watt level as well as the lumens per watt efficiency. This is a little better for simulating actual bulbs because bulbs have the watts and the efficiency, but it's really up to personal preference. Next we have the spot angle. Now this controls the angle of the spotlight. Of course, this is only a property that's available when working with spotlights. Next, we have the temperature preset. Now, built in is a bunch of presets based on real light bulbs, such as incandescent, halogen, and so on and so forth. You can mess around with these. Each of them have a different temperature and look. Or if you set this to custom, you can now use the light temperature slider. And this allows you to set the temperature based on the Kelvin scale. in degrees. So lower numbers are warmer and higher numbers are cooler. And you see if I increase the bloom, it actually adds a much nicer effect to our light. And of course the light rotation is something that only certain light fixtures have. It's visible on box lights as well. And these work the same way. Now this is one of my favorite features, and that is global illumination and indirect lighting. Now in the real world, if you were to shine a spotlight in front of a wall, the spotlight would actually have an influence on the wall behind it. The light would not just shine on everything in front of it, because the light will bounce off whatever it hits and go back onto the wall behind it. Now that's something that's not so easy and not built in by default to game engine lighting technology. So what we have to do is add other stuff on top of it to simulate that. So we have three modes. We have none, which is totally viable and totally useful in more moody, noir-ish situations. This is a functionality that's only available to pro users, though keep that in mind. So the other two options are multiply GI, which essentially just multiplies the light so it appears behind it. And this works pretty well for most situations, and it's very fast and it's very performant, and it works pretty well. But if you want something a little more accurate and also a little slower, you can go to Ray Trace GI. Now it's important to note that Ray Trace GI is not RTX lighting. It is a different technology that is much more simplistic. Basically what it's doing is it's just tracing a ray tracing, to where the light hits and then bouncing it back to whatever other surfaces. And then rather than putting that all into one single image, like RTX does, from my understanding, it actually places little point lights at those hit points, I suppose you can describe it as. What that basically means is that it's a little slower than the other option, but it is a lot more accurate. So you see here we have the light much softer behind it, as opposed to if I turn this off, you see you don't get that. It's slower and not good for fast moving lights. So for example, if I move this really fast, it takes a second for the light to update, but in my opinion, it looks a lot better. It also has a better influence on the color of lights. So for example, if I make this surface green, for example, and I rotate the light so it hits the light, or the green surface, when Ray Trace GI is enabled and the ground is set to a suitable material, the green light will spill over onto the ground, which is hard to see at the moment, in the way that it would in real life. You can see over here it has kind of a green tint. It might not show up well on camera, but in any case, it's here. So that's basically lighting in SceneForge. We also have the volumetric effect toggle, which I think I showed previously. It shows the simulation of the way light scatters with particles in the air. So that is lighting in SceneForge. Now I want to mention again that this is something that is being actively improved upon. Like for example, this is at 3000 lumens, which should be a lot brighter. The goal is to make it much more on par with the way you would adjust physical lighting while not having the same accuracy as physical lighting. The goal with that is just so it runs on the most platforms, because if the lighting was super accurate, it's not going to be as accessible to most computers, and that's something that is very important to us. Alright, so with that being said, the next video I'm going to talk about exporting content from SceneForge out into your computer to use in any other software.